Before we get into this video, as always, I'd like to clarify that most of this is going to be my opinion. I will be stating facts, but this is not meant to be an objective overview, so please do keep that in mind. That being said, let's go ahead and get into the video. Welcome to Christparency, the channel where we tackle misconceptions and uncover the truth about Christianity. Among the Protestant traditions that emerged after the Reformation, the Dutch Reformed tradition occupies a distinctive place. It combines strong theological structure, historical continuity, and a disciplined church system that has influenced Protestantism far beyond the Netherlands. So, what are the Dutch Reformed? The Dutch Reformed tradition refers to a family of Protestant churches that trace their origins to the Reformation in the Netherlands during the 16th century. These churches were heavily influenced by Reformed theology, particularly by the ideas of John Calvin and other Reformation thinkers who emphasized God's sovereignty and the authority of Scripture. Historically, the Dutch Reformed Church became the dominant Protestant body in the Netherlands after the country broke away from the Spanish Catholic rule. Over time, Dutch settlers carried their religious tradition to other parts of the world, particularly South Africa and North America. Today, churches that descend from this tradition include groups such as the Reformed Church in America and the Christian Reformed Church. What stands out about the Dutch Reformed tradition is its strong commitment to doctrinal clarity and church order. Unlike some Protestant groups that place a heavy emphasis on personal interpretation without much institutional structure, Dutch Reformed churches develop detailed systems for governance and theology. This structured approach has allowed them to maintain a relatively stable identity over centuries. For that reason, many people see the Dutch Reformed tradition as one of the more historically grounded branches of Protestantism. At the heart of the Dutch Reformed tradition lies Calvinism. Calvinist theology emphasizes several key doctrines: the sovereignty of God, the authority of Scripture, and the belief that salvation is ultimately the work of God rather than human effort. Perhaps the most commonly discussed summary of the Calvinist thought is the set of doctrines often abbreviated as TULIP. These doctrines were formally articulated during the Synod of Dort in the early 17th century as a response to theological challenges within the Church. Whether one agrees with every aspect of Calvinism or not, its influence on Protestant theology is undeniable. The Dutch Reformed tradition tends to approach theology with precision and systematic thinking, which can be appealing to those who value logical consistency in doctrinal matters. At the same time, critics sometimes argue that Calvinist systems can feel overly rigid or overly focused on abstract theological frameworks. Even so, the seriousness with which the Dutch Reformed approach theology is one of the reasons that the tradition has remained intellectually influential. The Dutch Reformed tradition is closely tied to geography and history. It originated in the Netherlands, where it played a major role in shaping both religious and cultural identity during the Dutch Golden Age. As Dutch exploration and colonization expanded, the church traveled with it. In South Africa, Dutch settlers established Reformed churches that eventually became central institutions within Afrikaner society. In North America, Dutch immigrants founded congregations that still exist today, particularly in regions such as Michigan, Iowa, and parts of New York. This geographic spread gave the Dutch Reformed tradition a global presence while still maintaining a relatively cohesive theological identity. In contrast to some denominations that fractured repeatedly as they expanded, many Dutch Reformed communities retained a strong attachment to their doctrinal heritage. One of the defining features of the Dutch Reformed tradition is its adherence to a set of doctrinal standards known as the three forms of unity. These documents serve as confessions that summarize the theological beliefs of the Church. The three forms of unity include the Heidelberg Catechism, the Belgic Confession, and the Canons of Dort. Each document serves a different purpose. The Heidelberg Catechism is written in question and answer format and is designed to teach basic Christian doctrine in a pastoral and accessible way. The Belgic Confession outlines the Church's theological positions in a more systematic format. The Canons of Dort specifically addresses debates about predestination and grace. Together, these three documents form a doctrinal backbone that has helped maintain unity within the Dutch Reformed tradition. Rather than relying purely on informal theological consensus, the tradition anchors itself in written confessions that guide both teaching and preaching. Another distinctive feature of the Dutch Reformed tradition is its three-office system of church leadership. The structure includes pastors, elders, and deacons, each serving a different role within the life of the church. Pastors are responsible for preaching the word and administering the sacraments. Elders oversee the spiritual health and discipline of the congregation. Deacons focus on practical service and particularly caring for the needs of the poor and vulnerable. The system reflects an attempt to balance spiritual leadership with practical ministry. Instead of concentrating authority in a single leader, the Dutch Reformed model distributes responsibility across multiple offices. In theory, this structure encourages accountability and shared leadership within the church. The governance of Dutch Reformed churches is also shaped by the Church Order of Dort, which was developed during the Synod of Dort in the early 17th century. This document outlines how churches should be organized and how they should relate to one another. It describes the roles of church councils, regional gatherings called classes, and broader assemblies known as synods. One of the strengths of this system is that it attempts to balance local autonomy with broader accountability. Individual congregations are not completely independent, but they are also not governed by a centralized hierarchy in the same way some other traditions are. The result is a form of church government often called Presbyterian or Reformed polity, where leadership operates through councils rather than a single authority figure. The key difference between this and Presbyterianism is that they are more focused on the local congregation rather than the church structure as a whole. One of the most noticeable traits associated with the Dutch Reformed tradition is its intellectual culture. Historically, Dutch Reformed communities placed a strong emphasis on education, theological study, and careful doctrinal reasoning. This emphasis produced influential theologians, philosophers, and scholars who contributed to Protestant thought. Institutions connected to the tradition often prioritize rigorous academic training for clergy and encourage members to engage deeply with theology. For many people, this intellectual seriousness is a major strength. It promotes thoughtful engagement with Scripture and prevents theology from becoming shallow or purely emotional. At the same time, critics sometimes suggest that an overly intellectual approach to faith can risk neglecting the experiential or relational aspects of Christianity. Still, the Dutch Reformed tradition's commitment to serious theological framework is one of the reasons it remains respected across many Protestant circles. So, why am I not Dutch Reformed? The biggest reason is not really theological, it's geographical and practical. I live in America, and Dutch Reformed churches tend to be heavily concentrated in very specific communities that trace their heritage back to Dutch immigration. In places like Michigan or certain pockets of the Midwest, these churches are common and deeply rooted in local culture. Outside of those regions, however, they can be surprisingly difficult to find. As a Presbyterian, the structural differences between the two traditions are not that dramatic. Both traditions share a broadly reformed theological framework and a similar understanding of church governance. Because of that overlap, Presbyterian churches are far easier for me to access while still providing a similar theological environment. In other words, the barrier is not primarily doctrinal, it is simply availability. If Dutch Reformed churches were more widely distributed geographically, that factor might look very different. One critique that is sometimes raised about parts of the Dutch Reformed tradition is a tendency towards legalism. In certain communities, the strong emphasis on doctrinal precision and moral discipline can drift into an atmosphere where rules and expectations dominate the spiritual life. Now, to be fair, this does not describe every Dutch Reformed church. Many congregations balance strong doctrine with pastoral warmth and humility. But historically and culturally, there has at times been a reputation for strictness, particularly in lifestyle expectations, cultural separation, and church discipline. The intention behind this is usually good. The goal is to maintain holiness, seriousness about sin, and faithfulness to Scripture. However, when that pursuit becomes overly rigid, it can risk overshadowing the grace-centered aspect of the gospel. In those cases, faith can start to feel more like a system of regulations than living a relationship with Christ. At the same time, one of the strongest and most admirable qualities of the Dutch Reformed tradition is its relentless pursuit of theological truth. This tradition has historically taken doctrine extremely seriously. Confessions, theological education, and careful interpretation of Scripture are central to its identity. There is a kind of intellectual honesty here that deserves real respect. Rather than constantly reshaping doctrine to fit cultural trends, many Dutch Reformed communities aim to preserve what they believe to be historic teachings of the Church. That commitment to clarity and consistency has produced a tradition that is deeply rooted and theologically robust. In a time when many churches prioritize comfort or popularity over doctrinal depth, that kind of seriousness about the truth is refreshing. Even for those who are not part of the tradition, there is a lot to learn from that level of commitment. The Dutch Reformed tradition represents a historically rooted and theologically structured branch of Protestant Christianity. Its Calvinist foundations, detailed confessional standards, organized leadership structure, and intellectual culture have given it a lasting influence within global Christianity. While not every aspect of the tradition will resonate with everyone, its commitment to doctrinal clarity, structured church governance, and theological depth explains why many people view it as one of the stronger Protestant traditions. The Dutch Reformed tradition demonstrates how a church can combine historical continuity, theological rigor, and institutional stability qualities that many other denominations have struggled to maintain. There we go, that is the Dutch Reformed denomination. I would highly recommend joining the Dutch Reformed if you feel so inclined. I think it is one of the best denominations out there. I highly respect the Dutch Reformed denomination. While it is personally not for me, I do think that it is one of the best sects of Christianity, personally. And I highly encourage you to visit your local Dutch Reformed church if you have one. I unfortunately do not, so I can't. But if you are able to, I would really recommend it, seeing what it's like, and If you guys do visit a Dutch Reformed church or go to a Dutch Reformed church, please let me know in the comments. I would love to hear about it. That being said, I hope you guys all have a very God bless day.